Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's John Florence, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here for this special evening. As you're probably aware, this is a fundraiser for the YMCA, and it's lovely to see so many of you here this evening. We're here to talk about comedy, and I think it's probably true to say there's more talk about comedy these days than for a very long time. Who would have thought only 5 or 6 years ago that certain national newspapers now employ a comedy critic to go around and look at the new acts and judge them and see what they're like? The concentration these days is very much on the performer, but of course behind every performer there are the hard-working boys and girls in the back room who write the words that the performers speak. And tonight, it's my great pleasure to welcome one of the great comic partnerships, one of the great writing partnerships of the post-war period. They've written, as that signature tune will remind you, of course, for Hancock's Half Hour, but also for Steptoe and Son, and any number of other comics. It's a great pleasure to welcome Alan Simpson and Ray Galton. I'm in a wonderful position here because I've been wanting to meet these two for so many years, and now I've got them here. I can ask them all these questions, but I promise I won't monopolise them. The format of the evening will be like this. I'll be talking to them for until about 8:30, something like that. Then there will be an interval, and then we'll throw open the evening. Well, the bar will be thrown open, yes, and the evening will be thrown open to you for you to ask whatever questions you like, and we can go on for as long as or as shortly as you like. But let me start off by asking how...
May I first say what a great pleasure it is to be interviewed by Lionel Jeffries' son. You were saying?
How much are you getting paid per question?
I'm certainly not resigning, I tell you that. Obvious question to start off with. How did you two meet?
Today? We met in a TV sanatorium. That's why I still smoke, you know, in Milford and Surrey, where we were patients, not nurses. And, well, that's where we met. So we
were extremely young. We were 18 years old. And I get my old age pension next week. Isn't that incredible? I mean,
amazing.
Do you think it's amazing?
No, I don't think so.
I think it's quite amazing. I don't look a day over 63, and I think it's incredible. No, we started in 1948. We met in as I said, with TV patients. In fact, anybody asks us now how do you become a scriptwriter, we say first you catch TV, and then you go into the Surrey County Sanatorium at Milford, and you meet someone like Ray Galton, and away you go.
All right, there you are. You're in this sanatorium. But how did you get this writing partnership underway?
Well, it's a long story, really. Because
we've got 2 hours.
Yeah, we were there 3 years, but we not tonight. There was, apart from being interested in comedy, all the things that were going on radio, BBC in those days. I was shoved in a two-bedded cubicle with some mad engineer guy, and he had the whole wall of our cubicle covered in engineering equipment. Amazing to think that this could happen in a hospital, but I mean, he had an electric drill on the end of his, and I had a vices on the end of the bed and things like that. And he had this huge REF 1155 radio, about this size, and it was all stove enamelled and beautiful. And he threw the aerial from one block to another, so we could get AFN, Munich, and Stuttgart. And so when around about in the afternoon time, reception improved, so we started listening to all the American shows, and he strung out some headphone wires and that to about half a dozen cubicles, and we listened to radio shows from AFN, Munich, Stuttgart. So we heard all the American shows as well as the BBC output. So we got very interested in that.
But Ray and this fellow were both confined to bed, not allowed to get out. You've got to realise that we were, in those days, when you had TB, you were in the sanatorium for a minimum of 2 years, and for more like it 3 years, and a lot of that time you were confined to bed. And this fellow Tony Wallace that Ray was talking about, he was confined to bed, as was Ray, but between them, they were clambering over roofs of the blocks, wiring up the entire sanatorium, which consisted, I know, of 650 patients. 320...
Spread over about 300 acres.
Oh, I mean,
So it was the first hospital radio, really, wasn't it?
I'll tell you, it certainly. But
I don't know what Mrs. Bottomley would say if you started doing
there
that
were
these days.
four blockfuls of women and 4 blockfuls of men. They weren't allowed to meet, only under very, very heavily guarded. It was a bit like Stalag Luft 23 when I think about it. But as I say, they were confined to bed, but between them they managed to wire up the entire sanatorium for a new programme. In other words, you had your earphones and you had 3 sockets. The light programme BBC, home service BBC, and this new one which Ray and Tony Wallace put up called Radio Milford. And it was run like a mini BBC. The friends of the sanatorium had bought lots and lots of gramophone records, and so we tried to organise, the radio committee was formed, and we organised a mini BBC. So you had family favourites, people would come in, relatives, and request a record for a patient. And so now for Charlie in F14, we have Get Well Soon, or whatever the thing, and it'd be played.
Most of the requests came from the women that you were not supposed to meet to the fellas that they were not supposed to meet, backwards and forwards. That was all the requests. All married, of course, except us young lads. But it was done from a converted laundry cupboard at the end of...
minuscule, wasn't it? I mean, it was a tiny little room. And all hand mics, nothing as elaborate as this.
Keep your hand on them and keep the...
And the other shows we did were all the sort of BBC shows that could be done under these circumstances. I don't know, you probably don't remember, you're all too young to remember a programme called A Seat in the Circle, which consisted of, on BBC, where they said, this week's Seat in the Circle, we take you to the Odeon Hammersmith, where Humphrey Bogart is playing in Casablanca, and off you go. And for half an hour, you would all be edited down. You'd have, and the commentary, now Humphrey Bogart walks through the room. And you hear the door open, and he walks up, ringing the bell and say, "Hello, sweetheart." You could hear
It was television without pictures.
Absolutely, it was incredible. And this was a big hit, Seat in the Circle.
See,
But we did this at Milford. Because every Wednesday evening in the food hall, they'd have a film. And so we got all our equipment up and we were doing A Seat in the Circle in exactly the same way they did on the BBC.
The only trouble was they were silent films.
It's just been riveting listening.
And the nurses used to play the doctors at tennis, and we used to do a thing, and Sister Shackles, and it's a left-hand serve into the far court, and it's up there. We used to do a mini Wimbledon. You know, it was incredible. Really, think about it.
I picture you also listening to all these programmes on the radio and listening to the comedy programmes. And did it work like this? Did you say, we can do better than this?
I don't know about we can do better. I think because Alan and I were eventually put into a room together.
There were two others.
Well, yeah,
You
there
don't want to
were
get,
four.
you don't want to get the wrong idea.
Yeah. In this case, there were 4 bed cubicles as well as 2 bed cubicles, and we discovered we had the same kind of humour and all that sort of thing. And I was we had occupational therapy as well as the radio room, and I was sort of making handbags and wallets, and Alan was embroidering. Was it? So I didn't really know what to make of him at the time, but my handbags and his embroidery went down very. But how do we get the idea about actually saying we would like to write?
Well, I think
a comedy
we had
show?
we had this radio committee. We used to meet in which Ray and I were just joined. We used to meet once to decide what sort of programmes we were going to put out. And I think Ray and I probably said, well, the one thing we don't do. Comedy programmes. We do a Seat in the Circle. We do we do Lucky Draws. We do
Chess moves,
news items and things, but we don't do a comedy programme. And so they said, well, all right, then who's going to write it? And we said, well, we will. Now, the only thing that I think either of us had any contact with was I was a member of a church concert party, which really consisted of not writing anything, but just copying. I used to do things like, what's his name, Galton. I used to copy things that he did. I never wrote anything. It was all nicked. Everything was nicked. And that's the only connection I'd ever had to with show business. And but we were both fans, and so we said we could do it. So we undertook to write 6 quarter-of-an-hour comedy shows, and we decided it would be based on sanatorium life. Taking the pastiches, and it was called Have You Ever Wondered? And it consisted of each week saying, have you ever wondered what would happen if patients took over from doctors? And then we'd do it was wildly original, as you can tell. The only thing is that after 4 we dried up. We couldn't think of any more, so that was a series of 4. And as I say, that wasn't the first time. It was the first time we dried up, but certainly wasn't the last over the years. But that's how it all started, and we got our first good review from a fellow, what was his name? The old fellow in F24. He said, a bouquet to the team of Have You Ever Wondered? Much, much better than anything we hear on the BBC. And we thought, we were going around showing this to everybody. That we dried up after 4, and we didn't write another word for about a year.
What happened then? When did you sort of have your breakthrough into...
Well, our 3 years were up. Our sentence finished in 1950, and we were thrown out. And I went back to the concert party.
and work.
No, not quite, yes, that's right, yeah, part-time, yeah, that's quite right, yeah. Part-time work, and Ray was on the dole.
National assistant.
National assistant.
Yes, I was still not considered
wasn't
fit
allowed
enough
to
to
work,
work.
no, that's right.
So I got 52 and 6 a week from the national assistants, which is quite generous.
I was only getting £3 for working, honestly. But anyway, I went back to the concert party and I said, "You're going to join?" I said, "Well, I can't do any, leaping about on stage because I've got to take things easy." So they said, "Well, have you got any ideas for sketches?" So I got in touch with Ray, and bearing in mind this was a year after the demise of Have You Ever Wondered, and I said, "Do you fancy getting together and writing some sketches for the concert party?" Which is exactly what we did. And while we were in the sanatorium, we'd also written a letter to Frank Muir and Dennis Norton, asking them how you become scriptwriters. And they wrote a very nice letter back, which really was palming us off. I mean, it was really, they said, if you've got any ideas, send them in to Gail Pesrick, who's the script editor of the BBC. And thank you very much for writing for, which, I mean, complete. We were expecting them to say, well, come to us and we will teach you how to do it,
But do we still send the same letter out to anybody now?
That's exactly right. Anybody writes to us now, we say, get in touch with the script editor of the BBC, because that's what we did, and it worked for us.
So they write back and say, he's been there for 25 years.
But anyway, that's exactly what we did. We wrote a sketch, which was a sort of a pastiche of the last sketch in Taken From Here. which in those days... well, no, the Glums was the middle sketch. The last sketch was always a take-off of a film or a novel, or, you know, and we wrote a sketch based on Henry Morgan the Pirate, consisting of about 12 pages of outrageous puns. I mean, things like, you know, be careful, you're steering towards the rocks, you're steering towards the rocks. You see, I told you, you should practice what you beach. I mean, unbelievable, isn't it?
We wrote better than the sanatorium.
Anyway, we sent this thing in. Oh yeah, one joke. Only one joke was ever used. You know, where were the crew? They're down in the hole playing Jane Russell pontoon. What's Jane Russell pontoon? The same as ordinary pontoon. Only you need 38 to bust. Somebody's heard of Jane Russell. That's interesting. Anyway, that was the quality of the material. We had a letter back from the BBC saying the royal we from Gale Pleasure, we were very amused by your script, and would you like to come in to see us, and we will see if we can do anything to help you. And Ray and I made an appointment, went to see Gale, and he was charming, lovely man, and he sent the script around to a few producers, and one day at the office I had a call from Derek Roy's secretary, asking whether Ray and I were going to meet Derek Roy with a view to writing some jokes for him.
If you haven't heard of Jane Russell, maybe you've not heard of Derek Roy either. But he was a very big, not physically, but a comedian in those days. And Frankie Howard was just about coming up, and they became sort of radio rivals.
Yeah, they were the two biggest really, because there was a show called Variety Bandbox, wasn't it? One week Derek would be the star, the next week Frankie Howard would be the star. I mean, they were really, really big. Anyway, so we went to meet Derek Roy, and he said, nice to meet you, lad. And he said, well, the arrangement is, he said, you go away and write jokes, one-line jokes on various subjects, and I pay you 5 shillings per joke that I accept. For you youngsters, that's 25 pence. 5 shillings. So we thought, that's fantastic, fantastic money. So we used to meet round my mother's house every day, I get the bus down. Now I come home from work and we write these jokes. And we go to Derek once a week. And we've never allowed in the dining room, have we? Never allowed, or the lounge. We always ushered into either his bedroom, bearing in mind that it was a small flat off of Bryanston Square, or the office. And Derek would have drinks with all these people in the other room, and we were shunted into... And then Derek would come and say, what have you got for us, lads? What have you got? And we give him about 2 or 3 pages of jokes, and he'd go, no, yeah, no, yeah. Johnny, his secretary, would come in and said, sort out the lads, will you? Nice to see you, lads. You go back to, entertain these guests. And we did go into the office, and Johnny Vivian, who was a tiny little man, about 3'6", he'd get these, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. At 7, 5 bob a time, 35 bob. We said, right, out the cash, petty cash, 35 bob.
Taxi to the Ritz.
That was it. And then on the train home, I was saying, right, so what's after 35, 17 and a tenner, 17 and 6 each.
And this is the Johnny Vivian who subsequently turned up
totally
in
undeclared. That was our first professional engagement.
Yeah.
5 bob a time for Derek Roy.
You see, it's interesting, isn't it? Because there you were writing gags, and one of the great things about the scripts that you wrote later on, in a sense, they weren't dependent on jokes. They were dependent on funny lines, but not jokes.
We were wise by then. 5 bob a time.
No, I think all writers start
with
jokes. Yeah. I mean, jokes as you go, as you learn to become writers, really. I mean.
Which were the famous names that you wrote for in those early days?
Well, we started with Derek Roy, and then we met Tony Hancock through Derek Roy, and then we were offered a show. We were now accepted.
Well, after writing these, silly jokes for Derek Roy, Derek had this enormous program on the radio starting. It was an hour show, with lots of guests, and it was called Happy Go Lucky. A misnomer, if there was ever. I mean, it was the
happiest show you've ever.
It was terrible. It was terrible. And there were writers coming in from Australia with big hats and corks hanging down. And I mean, 2 guys came down from Glasgow every week to write the show. Anyway, the show was terrible. It was falling apart around everybody. And in the end, the poor BBC producer, Roy Spear, had a diplomatic illness. He just threw himself on a stretcher and was carried out. And the head of Variety came down, and he delivered this real show business speech backstage, like, to all the cast, well, you got a turkey on your hands, but you're all troopers and you're going to go out there and we thought, this is show business. We've seen this on the film. And he had a little guy with him. It turned out to be another BBC producer, Dennis Main Wilson. And Dennis was going to take over that show. And he looked at us and said, are you writers? And we said, yeah. He said, can you write this show? And we thought, no, we can't, but it can't be any worse. And if we don't say yes, we'll never get anywhere. So we said yes. And he said, right, okay, can you write the last 3 shows? Which we did. And they couldn't get anywhere. I think they were better. And that's how we first started, really.
We were then on the list of BBC writers, and then we were asked to do another finish-off job for Bob Monkhouse and Dennis Goodwin, who were doing a show called Calling All Forces. And they decided to go on holiday after having written 84 consecutive shows, an hour long. And Roy and I were asked to do the last 6, which we did. And the whole point of Calling All Forces was the fact that you had guests, guest comic, guest singer, guest instrumentalist, and a guest actor or guest personality, within a format of an hour show with resident comedians as well. As it happened, it was Charlie Chester and Tony Hancock.
Sharing.
Again, we're sharing the resident. So this is when the first time we really started writing for Tony. And subsequently, after that was finished, we did 2 more series called Star Bill, All Star Bill, this type of thing. Exactly the same thing. An hour show with guest people, starring Tony and Moira Lister. But the point was that during that period of 2 or 3 years, we really learnt our craft, because we were writing for every comic in the business who was guesting on the show, and lots of people like Maurice Chevalier, Richard Attenborough, would you believe? But I mean, stars of all stage, screen and radio. Richard Burton, we wrote for Richard Burton.
You don't normally associate him with
Claire Bloom, we wrote for. That was on the Frankie Howard show. Yeah. We also, by this time, we were writing for Frankie Howard as well. But we wrote during that period, which is...
We wrote for every comic.
Every comic in the business.
So you had to adapt your stars.
Absolutely. This is the point. We wrote for Bernard Braden 1 week, Jimmy James the next week, Jimmy Edwards, Terry Thomas, every different comedian you can think of, and we were writing for them. And that was where we learnt our trade.
So when did this partnership between you two and Tony Hancock, when did that actually happen?
Well, the first meeting was very early on in this happy-go-lucky disaster. But in actual fact, the one part of it that we didn't write was the one bit that Tony was in, which was a Boy Scout sketch called The Eager Beavers, and he was the Scoutmaster. As a matter of interest, his 4 cubs, he's what do you call them?
Yeah, they're cubs.
Cubs, that's it, scout, yeah. Were Dick Emery, Graham Stark, Bill Kerr, Peter Butterworth. They were the 4, and Tony was the Scoutmaster. And that's the one bit we didn't write. But then he came up to us one day and said, how much do you charge to write a single? Single being, a stand-up piece for
workers' playtime and things like that. They had to provide their own script for that.
So we said, how much do you charge? Well, Derek Roy was paying us £8. So we said, well, and Derek said, Tony said, I'll tell you what. He said, I'll give you half what I get. So we said, all right. I said, how much do you get? He said, £50. He said, I'll give you 25 quid a script.
Probably guineas in those days.
Well, it was 25. I didn't want to confuse them. Guineas.
Well, I was adding a little class to it.
Bad enough. LSD. That was up to...
You take
so
that,
anyway, your dreams, 25 quid, which was a fortune for us. I mean, it's 3 times what Derek was paying, of course. 3, 8, 25. Yes, it was 3 times what Derek was paying. So the first thing we did was go to Derek and say, Derek, what's the matter? What's the matter? I said, well, it's just that Tony Hancock is paying us £25 a script. And yeah, I'm not kidding. He didn't even blink his eye. He said, "You've got to remember, lads, I gave you your first break." I mean, you wouldn't believe this man is the richest comedian in the country, and he wouldn't even up us to 10 quid. So needless to say, or needles to say, as we we didn't write for him much longer. We wrote where the money was. We went with the money, and so we started writing all Tony stuff. And then, of course, we got this calling all forces, and Tony was there as well, and that's how it all gelled. And the next natural step forward was to do a show with Tony, for Tony, a situation comedy, just for Tony, because we got very friendly by this time.
Now that really was something new, wasn't it, Hancock's half hour?
It was
a half-hour play, really.
Indeed, it was. I suppose really it was the original, in a way, situation comedy. I mean, there were other shows around that did storylines, but they were all split up. A lot of the American shows that Ray was talking about, they were all storyline shows, but they had an opening act, then a singer came on, and then a second act, you know. And we always thought it would be nice if we could do it without the, without the breakups. And also you get an extra 5 or 6 minutes of material, script time, to develop your characters.
Well, we thought it'd be a good idea to have no musicians breaking anything up, no singers, and we also thought it'd be a good idea if we no jokes and no funny voices. And the first person that was booked for the show was Kenneth Williams. But don't mess about. So that was that. But I mean, he had just been playing the Dauphin, St. James.
Yeah. Well, this is the first comedy thing he ever did. I mean, outright comedy.
So we didn't really think he was going to go no.
What about all those characters apart from Hancock in those? There's Maury Lister first of all, wasn't there? Then
we couldn't write for ladies.
Bill Kerr and Sid.
Well, I'll let you into a secret now. I mean, in actual fact, the format for Hancock's Half Hour was based upon one of the shows that we used to listen to on AFM all those years before, and it was based on the Phil Harris show, which had Phil Harris and his wife Alice Faye. It had a gangster character played by Sheldon Leonard, and it had a sort of a airy-fairy sort of friend played by the guitar player of the Phil Harris band, a fellow called Remley. I was going. So that was basically. So that was basically. See, because Dennis Mainboard said, "What are you going to do? I mean, you've got your. What's the format going to be?" And we thought, "Class, what are we going to do?" So then we thought, well, we knew what we wanted to do with him, and we just used that format. We didn't use any of the jokes, obviously, but that was basically. But instead of Alice Faye, we had Moira Lister originally, and then Andre Melly. And I think Geraldine McEwen was there as the female thing. The Hood, played by Sheldon Leonard, obviously was Sid James. And the friend was Bill Kerr. And Bill changed because when we first started, Bill was hello there, he was a sort of American type Australian wisecracking. Just want to tell you, Tub, that and it gradually he became Stan Laurel. Towards the end of the show, he was saying, "Well, Tub, I don't want to tell you that, there was a complete change around here." Hancock himself, if you listen to the first shows, he was playing it like that. "Oh, I did my word." Yeah. Right, and gradually, he gradually honed himself, mellowed, and then gradually started playing himself, which is what we were all after. But it takes time, you see.
I mean, let me ask you about that.
It takes time to develop.
That character that he played, and on the television as well, this rather glum figure that life defeats all the time, and aspirations are constantly being defeated by life. To what extent was that Hancock?
Well, no, it wasn't at all, really. I mean, when people say, was it Tony or was it you or was it Ray and yourself? I mean, the truth of the matter was, if this makes sense, I think we created the character of Tony Hancock in his image. Tony actually was nothing like Hancock's the character of Hancock, except for minor things. I mean, he was, vocally towards the end, was exactly the same. He had the Tony wasn't pompous. He wasn't, he wasn't.
See, there's no humour in success.
No, that's
there's no humour in success. There's no humour in success. The only humour there is in failure and pomposity, pricked. And so, this is what we found in Tony's character, or if it wasn't there, we put it in. That's really it. I mean, there is no humour in success. So.
Because Tony played it so brilliantly, and when you get the work, you see how it's being played, that influences the way it's written. I mean, the same way as later on in our career, Steptoe and Son. I mean, we when we first wrote, they were just two first rag and bowmen and second rag and bowmen. When we were writing, we didn't even know who was going to play it.
You have to hear the voice to get the line meaning in it. You have to hear the voice. If you're writing for if you're writing a book, a novel, or anything else, different. But if you're writing for a specific person or a character, you have to hear that voice in your head. Otherwise, you can't get the rhythm and the nuances and even the meanings of what you're trying to.
When you see what they do, with the work, the way they handle it. I mean, Harry Corbett used to do readings that we never ever dreamt of. Where did you get that from? He hasn't. The words are there, but he used it all over the place.
We used to look at each other sometimes.
So what did he say? But of course, then you think about it and say, yes, that's right. But Harry used to bring things to it that we used in subsequent scripts. Things that they did well, relationships worked. And the same thing with the Hancock. The Hancock scripts and the shows, over a very, very short period of time, because from the first Hancock's half hour in 1954 to the last one in 1961, you're talking, 7 years, in which we did 160 odd shows in 7 years. I may add that is impossible these days. Nobody ever, it's not possible to write, but nobody had told us that it wasn't possible, you see, so we did it. But during that period, it evolved, it changed, and a lot of that obviously comes from we learned from Tony. But basically, the character was our creation that Tony played to perfection.
I want to talk about perhaps one or two of the specific shows in a moment, but it sounds like a treadmill, what you just described.
We used to have holidays. I don't get holidays now, but we had holidays then.
I mean, how far in advance did you have to provide a radio script, for example? They recorded on a Sunday.
Well, a radio script, it really didn't matter how far in advance. They would, the actors would only see it on the Sunday morning. I mean, we'd record on a Sunday morning because they were working, earning a fortune all week, and that's why they loved radio. But they would see it on the Sunday morning at the Playhouse Theatre or the Garrick or wherever we were doing it. They would see it for the first time on Sunday morning, and they would just do a couple of run-throughs. They would sit down there, along there, and they would do a read-through. Then they would come up here and do it in front of a mic, and then probably do it with sound effects. And then it would be pub time, and maybe they would come back in the afternoon and do one more rehearsal.
And down the pub again?
Then down the pub again, which we would pass the audience waiting to come in. So no, they saw it a few hours before they actually broadcast.
And after the show was finished, the actors, oh my God, the pressure. Oh, Jesus,
they hadn't heard about television by then.
Would they laugh at your scripts when they first read them through?
Well, sometimes, Hancock, I must say, Tony was the most wonderful audience. I mean, if something really tickled him, he'd be in hysterics, which is a wonderful feeling when somebody's reading your stuff for the first time and they just fall about laughing. And he was a wonderful audience, and of course, he used to crack Sid up. And Sid had this guffaw of his, and Bill Kerr, I mean, when I think about it, they were all corpses. They were all laughers, because Ken Williams, we'll get to him later, of course, when we talk about his diaries. But Ken Williams used to fall about with laughter. I mean, Hancock, the way he did it, Guffaw, fall about with laughter, and everybody would be laughing at Ken. I mean, it was everybody was laughing, and then Ken used to go home and write this awful, this is a load of rubbish again. I hate these people, and so on. And he was killing himself laughing during the afternoon.
Well, you brought up the
Oh,
question
God.
of the Kenneth Williams diaries, which have been recently published. You must have read those with some interest. What did you make of them?
I did not recognise one part of the bits that applied to us. When he was talking about rehearsals and read-throughs and I mean, it wasn't like that at all. He said that, he used to, these idiots, these intellectual idiots, and
Not us.
not us, no, I mean, he was talking about Tony and Tony and Sid, and
Didn't mention us. Didn't mention us at all.
but no, and he used to say that he used to say things like another dreadful script, how they get away with this rubbish. I mean, you could read the diary, I mean, all I can tell you is that he used to come in the morning, read the scripts, this is wonderful, oh my God, you're brilliant,
But then, until the day Hancock died, of course, then and all these eulogies to Hancock then can change completely.
I've been told he used to spend lots of times with a lot of time with Hancock, and they used to swap, but when you read his diaries, you think that he hated every living, most odd. I can only assume that his diaries certainly weren't written 20 years later. But his autobiography was written, and you can understand 20 years later he's forgotten, what actually happened. But the diaries, he's gone back and written them that night. And all I'm here to tell you is that he was writing things that totally the opposite to what actually happened that afternoon.
When you listen to those programmes, it sounds
Strange.
like a wonderful team. I mean, Sid is absolutely superb.
It was.
And Bill and Ken, they work wonderfully together.
Absolutely. I mean, the whole, when finally we settled with Hattie Jakes in the end, all the other women, all the straight women left because we couldn't write for them. I mean, it's true, all our career, we've only written grotesque women, people like, people like Pat Hayes, lovely, all those sort of people. Like
Mrs. Cravat.
Mrs. Cravat, yeah. I mean, people like that and Hattie, we could write, grotesque women. We could never write straight women, And they were all very sweet, more or less doing every speech. I don't think you really need me. So I'm just saying, oh yes, and then what? Oh really? And then what happened, Tony? Oh, did you? I mean, you don't really need an actress, do you? Absolutely. And we were saying, if you can't get laughs out of the material, it's up to you if you want to go in. But no, but it's not our fault. But yes,
Not really politically correct.
I'm pleased
No,
to
you've
hear
never
it.
heard of it. The PC was somebody you did that to you.
PC 49, yeah.
Your nick.
It's interesting you saying that you'd got to hear that voice.
Yeah,
you had to write
yeah.
the voice. When you were writing, who did the actual writing, and did the other one pace something down? Did you imitate the Sid and Bill and Hancock as you were writing?
Certainly, we did trying to do the voices. Ray is a good mimic. He does good accents. He does good Scottish accents and good.
Not anymore.
No, but he was quite. I mean,
Lost the ability.
a good impressionist. And we used to sit as we are now, except that Ray was this side. He was where you see, and then I used to do the typing, you see, because while he was on the dole, I was in the office learning how to type, you see, so I became he still can't type. And I was doing the typing, but every so often he'd lean over, we wouldn't put anything down until we'd agreed it. We discussed the line, and then when it's agreed, I would put it down. And then occasionally I'd think of something, and go to it and say, what's that? And then quite often I was just Xing something out. But anyway, the thing is that we never ever put anything down until we'd both agreed. But I typed it out. But while we were throwing the lines backwards and forwards, we used to simulate as near as possible. But we didn't pick a part. I didn't always do a young steptone. We both do both voices. And they got all that money they got paid for doing that.
When you were writing the Hancock's half-hour scripts for the radio, and as you say, that was 7 or 8 years. Did there ever come a time when you just hadn't got an idea of the script? And what did you do then?
Frequently. Well, I mean, you know, just
practically every week.
No, really, I mean, absolutely.
I mean, our great, if anybody knocked on our office door and came in, they would find us invariably lying on the carpet, you know, out talking. Oh, we're not talking. Sometimes we didn't speak to each other for days and days and days. And then I'd say something, and I'd say, well, why didn't you say something, Alan? He said, well, I didn't think you were speaking to me.
I was waiting for you. I said, yeah,
Like he was waiting for me to say
I
something.
thought it was his turn, you know, he thought it was my turn, and 2 or 3 days ago passed, you know, and we were both thinking, oh, I can't go on. What's wrong with him? You know? What's the matter? He hasn't said anything he hasn't said anything for 3 days. And he was waiting for me to talk, and I was waiting for him. But when we had the point being that we had nothing to say, that was, you know, but when we did have something to say, we said it, and immediately off we go again. You know.
So something always did turn up?
Oh, yes, and when you get deadlines, I mean, something has to turn up, you know, and eventually you manufacture things. You see,
sometimes we recycled things.
That's
too.
right.
We've got, you know, amazing desperate. We would recycle.
We never waste anything. You see, if we used to get half an idea, quite often you get an idea that you could see for half a show, but not a whole show. What I used to do is write down that half an idea, and after a few years, I suppose, I had about 2 or 3 pages of half ideas all written down, and before we'd write a script, we always used to go over these half ideas to see if anything gelled. And occasionally, some of these half ideas, we'd think more about them and get a whole idea. And quite often, we'd take 2 half ideas and manage to stitch them together into a show. And occasionally, I remember on one occasion, we had 3 half ideas and we made a show out of it. And we cut them down, you see. We cut each of the half ideas down to a third, you know, and stitched them into... And when the show's finished, you think that, when the show was finished, you think it was written like that, you know,
Seamless.
Conceived from beginning to end. You know. But that's the technique. That's technique that you learn over the years, you know. But generally speaking, we used to take about 2 weeks to write a script. We wrote a script once in 3 hours. 3 hours.
3 hours?
Absolutely. We were stuck with a comedy playhouse. We were stuck with an idea. We'd been about
Friday
a week.
night, that was.
We'd been a week trying to think of something. We hadn't got a clue. And the deadline, you know, to send the script in for television to get the sets built, they've got to be in. The deadline was, you know, on the Monday, I think. And Graham Stark came into the office on the Friday evening. And he said, yeah, I've got a funny little bit in the Evening Standard tonight. And it was just a little clip, tiny little bit at the bottom of a column of the Evening Standard. And it said that the little report, I think somewhere in Cornwall, that 2 car drivers had driven up a narrow road, and they wouldn't let each other pass, and they started fighting. And the police were called and they were arrested. That was all it was, just a little tiny...
4 lines, yeah.
4 lines. And Graham said, a funny idea, it was a funny situation, and we said, Graham, thank you. And the next morning we went home, and the next morning we came in, Saturday morning, came in at 9 o'clock, and by 12 o'clock we'd finished a script called Impasse. And I mean, I couldn't type fast enough. You know, I don't have any typists in the room. You know, when the shoulder goes, because you can't type, you know, it just wrote itself. You know, we just gradually built up on this situation, and we had the AA man come because he represented when the RAC man represented, and they started having a fight, and then you know, gradually built it up from this one little piece. You know. Another time, it'd take us 3 weeks to write a script, and like Flaubert, every word would be torn from our bodies.
Can I ask you about one specific radio Hancock's Half Hour? And it's my favourite one. I expect it's for many people here, and it's the one which has been called Sunday Afternoon at Home, which strikes me as being incredibly daring because nothing happens in it. There are long pauses and there are sighs. And it's a wonderful depiction of what Sunday was like in the 50s. And I'm sure in years to come, sociologists will listen to this and will learn a great deal from it. Can you remember how that one came about?
Because all Sunday afternoons were like that. That was a terrible thing, especially in the 50s.
I mean, the subject was ideal for Hancock. I mean, the beauty of it was that that you could... we've seen how much we could get away with doing nothing, pauses. I mean, actually, in fact, we got paid the same money for writing half a script. I mean, you've got to take that into account. And of course, I mean, the longer they played it as well, the longer the pause went. Tony realised, the longer we paused, the laughter was building, and because they started milking it as well.
The terrible danger about writing about boredom is that you're going to bore everyone.
Yes, you've got to be very careful,
because
that's
I mean,
quite right.
you know, a lot of books and plays and that are based on boredom, but they do manage to bore the audience in the meantime. So no, that's a terrible danger. But you know, touch wood, we managed to avoid being boring about boringness. So that's really what made it successful.
What was a wonderful script. Let's move on to Hancock on the television. When the decision was made to put Hancock's Half Hour on the box, was that the first time you'd written for television?
But not quite. Tony had been doing. ITV started in 1955, and Tony was locked into a stage contract with Jack Hilton, and Tony hated doing the stage because it used to bore him, you know, doing the same stuff all the time. But also he just hated being on stage, going on. He wasn't a natural. He was a natural stage performer, but he didn't enjoy it. Hilton said, "Right, I'll let you out of the stage contract, but you must do in return a series of 6 for ITV," because Jack Hilton was one of the founder members of ITV, or had some shares in it or whatever. You know. So Tony agreed to do this series for ITV. Now Ray and I were under an exclusive contract with the BBC at the time, and we asked the BBC if we could write it, and they said, "No way, no, you're not allowed to. You're under contract. Otherwise you can't write for ITV." So we said, right. So Tony started these shows, and they weren't really all that successful at the time. You know, they were okay. They weren't, you know, they weren't as successful as the radio shows had been. So it was put to the BBC that it had been far more. The BBC knew that we were going to do a television series for them eventually, and so it was put to them that it would be far better for Tony to be a success on, you know, to make it easier for him to be a success on these shows, you know, for the future. So the BBC saw the point of this, and they agreed that Ray and I should be allowed to write the last 3 or 4 shows of this ITV series, providing we didn't get a credit. So we went to the Jack Hilton, and we said, "Well, we can't get a credit," and so
which worried him terribly.
But we can do the show. But anyway, to cut the long story short, they paid us twice as much money to do the ITV shows than the BBC were paying. So we finished these shows, 3 shows. That was the first television we wrote. You know, anyway, when we came to do Hancock's Half Hour for the BBC, we said, "Yeah, do you know what ITV were paying us?"
It's the same man.
So
Derek Roy contract.
BBC had to double their money for us. You know, I mean, it wasn't a fortune, but it was. You know, anyway, we got double the money. So that was it. That's how we started writing television for Tony. We tried to transfer the situation comedies onto television. Yeah.
But of course, well, Kenneth Williams was in some of the early ones.
He was in the yeah.
But he went, and I don't think Bill was ever in on the television.
Bill was never. And you see, the problem with writing, or we found anyway, the problem with writing the transferring from radio to television is that you don't need as much content on television as you did on radio. So we found that Tony and Sid were quite enough as for regular characters. We didn't need, you know, to give Billy's bit and then to bring in Snide.
Be getting in each other's way.
Yeah, too much. Didn't need it.
Sectionalised. You think we have to do a bit for Bill here, and a bit for Ken, and a bit for Hattie, and a bit for.
And we found that visually we could spread the thing. You know, we could spread an idea far wider. And I think we all agreed that we tried Snide on television. He didn't quite work. Visually, he became a caricature even more than he was on radio. I mean, it worked at the time. The one show he did, I think, was the Alpine Holiday, wasn't it?
That's
you know,
right.
I mean, it was funny. I mean, he got lots of laughs, and it was good. But it was somehow
the reality we were striving for. We didn't achieve for a long time.
So we dropped to Bill. We decided that we didn't need the Bill character right from the word go. And we didn't need Hattie. We didn't need, you know, we just needed the 2 boys, you know, Tony and Sid.
And Sid was a very experienced performer by then, wasn't he?
I mean,
well, Sid was the most experienced performer of the whole lot. I mean, he had made 500 films, and so he knew the camera.
But Sid was making 10 films a year, which is, you think about that, 10 films a year. And and he was telling Tony a lot of the time what to look out for. Sid was watching all the monitors around the set, and he'd go up to Tony and say, "Tell him you need a close-up after the such and such." Because Sid was only the supporting. Tony said, "Sid says I need a close-up after the." And
Tell me, some Vaseline round the lens.
and Duncan was saying that bloody Sid Jones, no business. But Sid, he sort of guided Tony to a certain extent on how to play to cameras. See, the funny thing about that from Sid's point, but when we first cast Sid in the radio shows, Sid was petrified of doing radio. He said, "I don't know, I've never done radio, I don't know what." So Tony said, "All you've got to do is read the script." I said, "Oh, I don't know about that, I don't fancy that at all." "Oh, don't be silly, it's easy. So you haven't got to learn anything, just do it." So Sid, and he used to come on, he used to wear this hat, for the radio, pull it down over his eyes so no one could see him. Hold the script up in front of his face like that, so that the audience couldn't see him. And he'd play most odd. And then after about 3 or 4 weeks, and he suddenly realised what a piece of cake it was. I mean, he was just throwing the script away and playing it down there, and as if he'd been doing it all his life. Petrified, quite incredible. But
go on.
No, I say, but he did nurse Tony through the original television shows. Yeah.
I mean, the sad thing was that, of course, as the television went on, Tony made the decision to drop one person after another.
That's the story.
That's the story.
What's the story from your point of view?
Well, we dropped him, I suppose, in the progress to television, because we found that we couldn't fit them in.
But we got rid of it. Was our decision to not have Bill and Ken and Hattie in the television series for the reasons that we've told you. Now, when it came to Sid. See, what was happening is that it was becoming almost like Laurel and Hardy. It was Morecambe and Wise. It was becoming Hancock and James.
It's a double act, yeah.
So it was becoming a double act. And Tony always felt that they weren't a double act, which of course they weren't, because Sid, as I said, he was doing 10 films. Sid had a career outside of Hancock's Half Hour, whereas Hancock's Half Hour was Tony's career. And Tony always felt that eventually it was going to be limited. And Ray and I absolutely agreed. We agreed with Tony that it was time that he branched out without Sid and did it on his own. And Sid, was a bit he wasn't over the moon about it, but at the same time, Sid was a professional enough to realise, to see the point. And also, he did have this career outside of his film career.
Yeah, I think
what?
Soft over. I mean, Sid was quite devastated, really, about the split.
Yeah, but he still had his career.
Of course he did, yes. But I mean, Sid also was very, very content to be a second banana. He didn't want to be a star, because he realised that then everything would depend on him. And so he, in films and in Hancock's Half Hour, he was very, very content to be the second banana.
Anyway, we decided.
And he and Tony were, like that. They were friends on and off stage, and so were their wives, and they would go out together all the time. So he was quite devastated about the split.
We agreed to smooth it off, and I wrote a series for him called Citizen James, his own series.
That nearly finished it, but
with Bill Kerr in it, so we've got Bill in as well. But anyway, the thing was that that became the last Hancock's Half Hour. It was called Hancock. Dropped the half hour. That was the very last series.
And we moved him away from East Cheam.
That's right, and we moved.
Took his hat off, put a different hat on.
And the very first one we did, in order to, people said, "Do you think he'd be able to work on his own? What's Tony going to be like on his own?" And so we deliberately wrote the script where he was totally on his own, without any support from anybody else, which was Hancock, now called Hancock Alone. And that should just prove to everybody that he could work on his own.
And that was the series with the radio ham in it as well.
See, the people still come up to you and say, because he was never the same without Sid James. And we said, well, what do you think of the blood donor? It's wonderful. Yeah. Best one of all. Yeah. The radio ham, the lift, the arches, none of them was Sid James. I didn't think of that.
Yeah, I can remember reading you're quoted as saying somewhere that at this stage, Hancock was saying to you things like, "We can do better than this."
Oh, yes.
And you're saying to him,
"We never said
how?" And he didn't know how.
Well, we should have said, "Well, then go on, do it." You realise that. Yeah, it was the royal wheel. You know, we can do better than this. It was all over really. The split with Ray and I and Tony was all over the film. The film situation we'd done The Rebel, and we had a 3-picture contract, 3-picture deal with ABPC. The first one was The Rebel, and it was reasonably successful. I mean, in fact, it was very successful at the box office, and was a reasonably, for a first film. Bearing in mind that comedians in this country had a terrible reputation of being of not being able to transfer onto the screen. I mean, certainly post-war. I mean, you had Will Hay and one or two others before the war who had been very successful on screen, but subsequently, people like Norman, I suppose Norman Wisdom was successful.
But it didn't start on television, really.
No, that's right. But all the ones that went from television to radio seemed to struggle. From television to film, struggled, and so Tony with The Rebel did very well. And because he now thought the second one was the turning point of his career, and the second one was going to be the most vital, decision that he was ever going to make. And also he had this thing about wanting to be international, which really meant, America. And he was unknown in America because in those days they didn't take any of our material. And so he got this thing about it's got to be international. So Ray and I used to meet with Tony and say, right, the idea for the second film, agree an idea. We agree one called The Brothers, where it was a sort of a bit like The Sheep Has 5 Legs, the old Fernando picture, where Fernando played all the 5 parts, and we were going to have Tony playing 4 brothers that inheriting from, and each was going to be an episodic thing. We played all these 4 different types, doctor, a surgeon, a layabout, And after about 3 weeks, Tony phoned me. I've been thinking about ideas. I don't think it's right. And we'd written about a third of it. So we said, all right, that's fair enough. So we met again, and we came up with another idea. I think it was called The Cruise or something, whatever. Anyway. And we wrote about 2 weeks on this, and Tony phoned up and said, he said, I haven't read it, but I don't think it's right. So he said, I don't feel happy. He said, we can do better than that. So we agreed another idea called A Day Off, where it was going to be 24 hours in the life of a man who has a day off. And it was going to, I suppose, in the Jacques Tati type of Mr. Hulot's Holiday type of format. That was the idea of it. And we thought, well, Christ, that'll be international enough, surely, So he said, that's the one, that's fantastic. So we said, at this time, we go away and we write it, and you don't ring up after 2 or 3 weeks and say you changed your mind. No, that's fine. So Ray and I went away and wrote the entire screenplay, which still exists, and at the end of it, we sent it in, that all nicely typed out, sent it in to Tony. Bearing in mind, we're not getting paid anything. I mean, 6 months has gone by now, we haven't earned a penny. Send it in to Tony, and now if Tony liked a thing, the next day he was on the phone saying, read it, Mum, Next day went past, nothing, no phone call. 2 days, no phone call. So Ray said he doesn't like it. And I said, well, maybe, he's a slow reader, give him a chance. 3rd day, 4th day, and after a week, this sort of, red-faced, I imagine he was, hello, it's Tony. And we had a double, Ray was on the, He said, I've read it. And we said, yeah. Didn't help him at all. And he said, well, what do you think? And Ray, by this time, was quite belligerent. He says, we like it. He said, well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure at all. I don't think it's right. And that, and that really was the end, And we said, Tony, we've been writing 6 months on this. We haven't had a pen. We've got to earn some money. He said, well, why don't you go and write some television? Earn some money, and then we'll get back together and we'll really do something that's going to knock their eyes out. We can really come up with something. So we said, right, we'll do that. And we went away and we wrote Comedy Playhouse, out of which came Steptoe and Son, and we never wrote another word for Tony Hancock.
I don't know about you, I had an absolutely brilliant evening. It's been absolutely superb, and it's been, for me, it's been an enormous pleasure just meeting these 2 men. Because when I think of the enormous pleasure which you 2 must have given over the years...
Apart from the PC.
to so many people. I mean, I can remember, I was brought up in a family that loved Hancock, and so many of the lines that you slaved over passed into the currency of the family. So we've only got to say, my brother and I and my father, things like, you know, I thought my mother was a bad cook, but at least her gravy used to move about. That's the goodness in it. That's the half a pound of flour you put in it.
You remember the follow-up.
Lines which are pure minted gold. It's been wonderful meeting you, and thank you so much for coming to Leicester this evening. Thank you very
It's our
much.
pleasure. Thank you.